Read Smart, the Baillie Gifford Prize podcast. This podcast is generously sponsored by the Blavatnik Family Foundation. Hello, I'm Georgina Godwin. Welcome to Read Smart, the official podcast of the Baillie Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction. This is a podcast where we bring together eminent critics, our prize judges, and leading non-fiction authors to discuss their work and the ways in which it reverberates in the wider world. If you enjoy what you hear, please do follow us on your podcast app, share us, or take a moment to write a review. As always, we're immensely grateful to the Blavatnik Family Foundation for its generous sponsorship, which makes this podcast possible. On today's episode, we'll be exploring the crucial topics often overshadowed by mainstream media and the vital news stories that remain overlooked in the world. I'm delighted to be joined by a panel of guests to discuss the issues that they believe need more airtime. Joining me today is John Vaillant, who won the 2023 Baillie Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction with Fire Weather, a true story from a hotter world. Social geographer Danny Dorling, and writer and award-winning journalist Jennifer Nadel. Thank you all for joining us today. John, if we could start with you. Your book, Fire Weather, A True Story from a Hotter World, paints a vivid picture of the devastating impact of fire, serving as a metaphor for the escalating climate change crisis. Do you think that the mainstream media is doing enough to portray the urgency of this issue? And what more can be done to ensure that the public understands the gravity of the situation that we're in?
I think climate scientists and climate communicators have a lot of frustration with the media right now. Major incidents are often reported, big fires, big floods, devastating hurricanes. They get the news, but what they don't get are the connections to CO2, the connections to the petroleum industry, the connections to what is really a fire-powered civilization that is changing the world as we know it. And so that is where I feel like communicators like me and my colleagues, those of us on the podcast today, are trying to pick up the slack and fill in the gaps. And I think we have an opportunity in a way that many in the mainstream media don't have, is we have a longer time horizon. We have more time to explore connections and create a richer sense of story and to really craft a piece of work. And, I think there are exceptions to that, though, in terms of long form journalism in, New Yorker, New York Times, Guardian Weekly. They're different. There are places for more nuanced stories like that. But I think in general, there's a lack of dot connecting. As far as remedying that, I think the short-term hits, the daily media are really critical to this endeavor. And I feel like, books like mine sort of play a kind of backing role, but we really need our weather reporters and our on-the-ground news people to be making that connection and driving that home really day after day and incident after incident. And there's so many different ways to do it without repeating oneself. And there's so many ways to do it that offer these kind of little tidbits of needle-moving education for the average viewer who may not be following the issues as closely as we are. So there are a lot of missed opportunities there, and we're trying to kind of gather those up and present them. But I think it would be better if it was done piecemeal, day to day.
Danny, you're currently working on a book about what you believe to be the largest crisis in the world, and that's unemployment. You've noted that this issue was a top concern in 2016, but that it seems to have become overlooked by mainstream media. In your opinion, what's changed?
Well, unemployment was actually the second, depending on how you count it. So what I've been looking at is, what do people say when you ask them what are the biggest crises in the world? And this is done by Ipsos Mori. They're an international survey firm, and their survey includes India, which matters in terms of population. There were also surveys done by the Chinese Academy of Science, once you've got India and China in, and a lot of countries in Europe and the US. You're onto roughly half the world. Now, obviously, the The answers are affected by how the questions are asked. But they've been asked every month for years now, what worries you the most? And some of it's predictable. So when, of course, when the pandemic began, illness and transmissible diseases rises up suddenly. And now that has risen down very much. Various combinations of poverty, inequality, and cost of living crisis, when combined, are the main focus of the middle class of the world because it's immediate. And then this is another, it makes on to John's point about the speed of things. But what interested me most was that the second most often mentioned crisis, when you looked at the top three that people mentioned, was unemployment. And we often forget that unemployment is a huge fear for many people around the world. And these surveys tend to be filled in by better off people. You have neglected issues, if you like. So it's very unfashionable to talk about unemployment now in the UK and the USA because the official rate is very low. But huge numbers of people are in precarious employment, have no contract at work, are doing 0 hours work, or face the chances of an employer going bust or simply firing them and having to look for another job. And this just weighs on the minds of people. And because something like unemployment, we don't in the UK have very high up our priorities because we have an officially low rate. Because that weighs on people's minds, because we don't have the kind of job security that we used to have in the 60s and 70s, other issues like climate change drop down. When you actually say to people, what are the major issues in the crises today, they will mention the price of things, the chance of not having a job, being able to secure a house, worries about war and so on. And then these longer term issues drop down because of the very, very real fears of a huge proportion of people in the better off countries of the world, which is often less of a fear of many people who get to, like me, who get to write the books. I have a university job. Yeah. You know, it's pretty secure. And I'm mentioning unemployment because it was a shock to me to see it as such a consistent concern. It's across the age range, but obviously young people trying to get their first job, but also people approaching retirement, worried about will they get another job if they lose their job. And you often hear, you know, people are just 3 months paychecks away from having nothing. So we have to be aware, I think, of the plethora of concerns that are on the top of people's heads, how this varies between different countries, because there are very different forms of unemployment insurance. If I was in a country in mainland Europe, I might find myself not that much worse off if I was unemployed. I might be on 80% of my salary for some time. In the UK, it's about £10 a day. Most of the middle class don't actually know what they would get because they can't imagine living on it. So I have this interest in these wide range of issues, not just because they hurt people, but also because they affect our ability to deal with bigger structural things because we are not thinking ahead that far, many of us, because we are worried. Interestingly, it's not the major concern in China. There it's healthcare and actually getting access to healthcare, you know, which is a preoccupation where it isn't automatic how you do it. So I find surveys fascinating and try to look into them to see what they tell me about my fellow human beings, and their concerns are often quite different from my own. I work in the School of Geography and the Environment. We have over 100 climate change scientists in this building. If I was to ask a random colleague on the corridor, what is the major issue in the world, they would say climate immediately, as would our students. But if we wonder why aren't things happening, given that, it's because most people's lives are not like the lives of people inside a university.
Jennifer, Danny was mentioning surveys, and there was one that came out today that found people's trust in governments and politicians and confidence in the systems of government is as low now as it's ever been in the last 50 years, if not lower. Now, I know that honesty within politics is an issue that you believe is often overlooked. In your opinion, what are the possible reasons for the insufficient reporting of this issue in recent years?
We have normalized a really distorted and dysfunctional way of doing politics. We are meant to be the mother of all democracies in this country, and we are a very dysfunctional mother, and we have exported a very dysfunctional a mothership across the world, a very dysfunctional model across the world. We have a system that is really archaic and arcane. It was set up to try and withhold power from the people and has grudgingly allowed increasingly more of us to have access of it, but still at a cultural level excludes many of us from it. And it is absolutely not fit for purpose, is inefficient, have archaic procedures. It is disrespectful. You just have to watch Prime Minister's Question Time or any of the other debates that happen within the House of Commons. We see people booing and jeering our elected representatives, behaving in ways that would be totally unacceptable, that would be dismissible forms of conduct in any other sphere. And yet those are meant to be our leaders. And in addition, there are no laws governing their honesty or their conduct. There is a code of conduct that is enforceable only by the Prime Minister, who decides whether or not to enforce it. And we need to have enforceable codes of conduct. We need to have an independent ethics commission. But more than that, we can't, that's just kind of patching up a leaking ship. We need to really shift the way we do politics. We need to change our voting system. We need to have an elected second chamber that's truly representative of the people that it serves. And we need to move away from a conflict-based model of trying to resolve complex problems. The whole notion of debate, debate is a tug of war between two sides trying to win an argument. But, we are the losers within that model, because actually what we need are solutions, and the sort of solutions that we need to the complex problems that Danny and John have touched upon involve us all collaborating, and they involve us coming out of our fight and flight short-term thinking way of operating into something that is really long-term and strategic and able to look across into the future. And when we do that, of course, we realize that the issues that we've been discussing here are all interconnected. Consumption, employment, climate, they're all intimately connected. But in this world where we like to compartmentalize things, we see them as separate, and that's part of the reason why it's so hard to tackle them within the current way that we do government.
Why do you think that the press, the mainstream media, report insufficiently, though, on dishonesty in politics?
I think it's taken as a norm. There's that famous quip, how do you know a politician is lying? Their lips are moving. We've normalized dishonesty. We think that it is standard practice. And that really is the greatest lie of all, because if you were to deliberately tell untruths in the course of your medical practice, in the course of selling coffee, in the course of teaching in the classroom, there would be rules that governed it. We have laws that govern deliberate misrepresentation of facts, and the courts adjudicate on this the whole time. And yet somehow we've bought this lie that politics should be almost above the law and beyond truth. And we are really at a moment in our history where we cannot allow this lie to be perpetuated. AI is going to mean that the lies that are told that exist within the system are going to be perpetuated and distorted. We just have to look across the world to see how lack of truth, mingled with a candy floss sales pitch, fuels the far right and the othering that goes with that. And we really have to have a reset. We have to come back to the values that most of us live by. And honesty is really crucial if we want to restore faith in the democratic process. We need honesty. And furthermore, if we want a functioning democracy, we need honesty, because when people go to the ballot box, they make a decision based on the evidence that they have about policies. And if we can't trust that evidence, then there's no pure decision making that is possible on the part of the people who are meant to be electing the government. So honesty really goes to the heart of the political process. And there's an opportunity here, but there's also a crisis.
John, just picking up on that fact that the media sometimes does overlook huge issues. I wonder, when you consider the fire in Fort McMurray in 2016, the subject of your book, how was that covered by mainstream media? Were there aspects of what happened that really just didn't make it out there?
Absolutely. And I've really been resonating to what Jennifer has been saying, because Canada has a similar political model and structure to the UK's. Ours, mimics it, and we see the same behavior in Parliament and the same kind of lack of seriousness in terms of just the abuse of language people use and what people seem to get away with now. And I think that is in some ways reflected in how really serious, life-changing events like the Fort McMurray fire are reported. And for one, this notion of what is a fact, what do we agree on? This has created an enormous stumbling block for meaningful climate action, and probably meaningful action on employment too. Is when the fire broke out, people were, rallied around the people of Fort McMurray. They rallied around the people of Alberta. Huge donations of money and energy and material were made. This was a national catastrophe, and the people responded appropriately. From the heart, without question, they really moved in there and took care of this, nearly 100,000 people who were suddenly homeless. That's really what happened in an afternoon. The biggest, most rapid evacuation due to fire in modern times. And Canadians absolutely stepped up from coast to coast. That said, when you tried to ascribe a cause to the fire, beyond the fact that it was a wildfire that swept through the city, when you tried to talk about temperature, relative humidity, the skewing of natural systems, the preternatural dryness of what is normally a very wet ecosystem, people in Alberta in particular, but also people on the right, really took umbrage at that and said, now is not the time to talk about climate. And it's and when else would you talk about it? And this is obviously the priority is human safety and human life, and that is absolutely where the first energy went. But as people tried to make sense of this absolute catastrophe, the most expensive disaster in Canadian history, there was a whole segment of exploration and cause that was kind of off the table. And in Alberta, it was considered almost traitorous, almost treasonous to ascribe climate to it. And that is because Alberta is effectively a petro state. And so you have this huge industry that has many, many lobbyists, an enormous amount of resources it can bring to bear for legal services and lobbying services, not to mention just the machinery that it controls across the country. You have this huge segment of the economy, the energy industry, that doesn't want to engage seriously with climate because of the implications on that industry. And so it creates this elephant-sized blind spot in the room and in the discourse. And that really skews the nature of reality. And yet, ask any sentient person, and they can feel the world around them is changing. If you were to get an Albertan at the bar or, at a restaurant or sitting down, on a long bus ride, they would speak to you from the heart about their experience and about the changes they're seeing and their frustration with meaningful action. They may not talk about climate in the same way, but they would talk about these changes that they're seeing. And in this way, Alberta is the Texas of Canada. And it shares many of the same attributes, including basically silencing, censuring among the political class there of people who talk about climate. You're not allowed to talk about it. And again, it's seen as treasonous or traitorous to do so. And yet there are the workers who now have really measurable, actual mass PTSD because of their experience with fire. And now, 10 years ago, if you asked someone in Canada if they knew of someone who'd been evacuated due to fire, the response would be very spotty and regional. Now, 10 years later, You can ask any Canadian, anywhere from Newfoundland to Vancouver Island, do you know someone who's been evacuated due to fire? And they will say yes. And that's the entire country, and it's a huge country, second biggest after Russia. So this is a huge change, and it's a climate change. And yet, there are huge swaths of government officials, industry officials, and thus parts of the country who aren't able or willing to address it in a direct, meaningful, and responsible way.
I mean, Danny, I wonder if you think it's the media's responsibility to highlight big issues. I mean, for instance, what more could be done within particularly the mainstream media to help alleviate the issue of unemployment? Do you think that the unemployment rates will change in the next couple of years? And could that be media driven in any way?
Well, I'm a geographer. So one thing I do is compare countries, and we have international rankings of the media. The media which is judged by journalists to be the fairest in the world is in Finland. The more equal European countries tend to have the most reliable media. It can look, if you're English, possibly from Canada, I don't know, but certainly from the US, it can look boring. If you were to read the daily papers in Finland, I read the translations, it's very factual, lots of information, but being truthful is seen as the first priority. Not being sensational, not being exciting, not worrying about celebrities or media folk so much, talking about everyday life and what's going on. And it's perhaps not surprising that Finland has one of the most ambitious targets to be net zero very early. If you were to look at policies of different countries around the world and what their targets and their behaviour is, I think you would see quite a strong correlation between worrying about climate change and doing something about it, and where there was relatively higher quality and where concerns for social issues were higher. Canada always sits in an interesting position. It used to sit halfway on many other agencies between the US and the UK. In some ways, sadly, the UK's got worse, and so Canada is kind of, we can have a competition of which country is worse, but it's interesting to watch the changes and the differences. But simply beginning to accept that some of us, including in the UK, because of our newspapers mainly, have an extremely biased media that is ranked very lowly by journalists internationally for its reliability. In the case of the UK, our newspapers are almost all owned by very rich families who own them for a particular purpose. They want to send a particular message to the electorate and alter their opinions about things. We've been lucky in the UK in that we've had a climate consensus politically, but we see a little bit of the fight at the moment because we have a general election campaign, and it's mainly in Scotland and the position of the Conservatives, Labour and the SNP on what's happening in our very small equivalent for Alberta, which is Aberdeenshire, and where the North oil industry is based. There are three very different policies being put forward to try to secure just 3 or 4 parliamentary seats in that area. But politicians kind of give themselves away at this point when they're going after the votes. And journalists, I should say, are amazingly frustrated by this. Journalists who work for the Daily Mail, the Express, the Times, they almost all have views which are far more progressive than the papers they work for. But to keep their jobs, they have to write things that they know are rubbish. And this is a terrible situation to be in. Some of those newspapers are actually owned by the same holding company, and they have offices in the same building, but there's a different line from the editorial staff over what they should do, they should say. Sky, of course, is we were one of the first countries to get Sky. Which there are rules about how Sky can behave on terrestrial broadcasting and some watchdog, but still, compared to the scrutiny and blandness, but also truthfulness that the media in some countries has, and about raising issues and not concentrating on tittle-tattle. Who's divorced who, what particular thing has occurred there. I'm often watching the news and think, why is this news? What is it that they didn't want to talk about today? And then in other countries, I'm often very heartened to see that things we might talk about in lectures are on the news. And really interestingly, newspapers in more equal socially advanced countries tend to use really complicated graphics, partly because their populations can understand difficult graphs, because education levels tend to be better as well in countries that care more about the climate and care more about people.
I wonder, given, of course, that we know the general election here in Britain's coming up on the 4th of July, this issue of honesty in politics, and that must include stats on climate and unemployment and so on, it does feel more relevant than ever. And in the lead up to the election, I wonder what you think the mainstream media could do, what steps they could take to ensure that politicians are held accountable, to promote transparency and honesty in politics, and what might be the potential impact on the upcoming election if the mainstream media fails to do so.
I think there are two really interesting points about the media at this moment in history. The first is, if we trace back what has happened, the news media has gone from being an information providing service to being an entertainment service. And I was a broadcast journalist at the time that this happened. There was a documentary made, Death on the Rock, which Margaret Thatcher did not like. And her revenge on the broadcasting industry was to destabilize the holding pattern for ITV News. So I actually worked for ITN at the time that this happened. When ITN was stable and a news provider, an information provider, the only time I covered a court case was if it had lasting implications for the legal system or for the nation. But the moment we had to prove that we were successful in terms of rating figures, suddenly the editorial agenda had to shift, and suddenly prurient court cases or court cases involving big personalities and stories that would get eyeballs watching them started to rise up the media. And of course, that then had a knock-on effect on the BBC, because the BBC wants to retain its license fee. And if no one's watching the BBC, its argument to retain its license fee and be the public broadcaster becomes harder to make. And so we now have a race to the bottom because market forces have been introduced to the broadcast media, and that in turn has a knock-on effect elsewhere because everyone is competing for viewers and for readers. And the same thing has happened if you look in the print media. You know, the Times used to be a paper of record. The Daily Telegraph used to have the highest story count of any newspaper. You would read it and you would get the most comprehensive understanding. Yes, it may be slightly not to your political taste. If you read it now, it is propaganda. I mean, it is absolutely staggering what has happened to the media in this time. So obviously, there's a distinction between print and broadcast. In terms of broadcast, the broadcast media are really trying to do their best to fact check. BBC has its own unit that checks information. If you watch ITN, they will often challenge figures and are very robust in their interviewing. And so the media is doing what it can, but it sits within a broader culture. It sits within a marketplace where it's obliged to retain viewers, and it sits within a culture where deception is expected and normalized, and everyone shrugs their shoulders and say, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? And we end up with the sort of survey that we've seen released today, where we see that voter trust is the lowest since the days of Margaret Thatcher.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, John, you also write for the newspapers. Are you finding, since Fire Weather won the Baillie Gifford Prize and obviously brought you a much larger audience, that major papers are more willing to run environmental pieces? And is that because of your personal success, or do you think that goes across the board? Is the media now really waking up to this issue?
I think after the summer of 2023, Canadian media would have to be buried under a rock not to be more tuned in. It was so shocking. You know, it really was our black summer, not unlike what happened to Australia in 2019 and 2020. And so I think the physical damage that was done and the psychic damage that was done to citizens who saw these fires, who had to flee these fires, really, it got real, you know, to use that cliche. And I think the media has responded to that. And I think to some degree, governments have responded. So we've had evacuations already this year. Part of Fort McMurray was evacuated just a few weeks ago because of a threatening wildfire. And that was done preemptively because it's traumatic to evacuate a wildfire when there's fire burning next to your vehicle and you can't go anywhere because there are 10,000 cars in front of you trying to get to the same place. So we learned some really hard lessons over the past decade. And I think municipalities and governments are responding. And I also think the media is too. And CBC, which is under some of the same threats that the BBC is, but they really are addressing climate change and speaking the language of science pretty directly and pretty reliably now. So I think we've moved the needle, and I think fire weather, it's more the right story at the right time. I think the momentum was going there anyway, but fire weather presented the story in a way that a lot of people outside the choir can relate to.
Yeah.
And so it became more of a national property in that sense.
Danny, when we talk about the environment, we're also talking about human impact. Do you think that policymakers and the public thinking are talking enough about demographics? Particularly here, I'm thinking about falling birth rates and aging populations.
Falling birth rates in a way are quite a good thing worldwide. That's largely happening without coercion. Especially women are choosing not to have more children. They're not being forced to have more children. The result of that is aging. Most of the increase in the population that we're going to see as we head towards 9 or 10 billion. And by the way, children are going to be the first human beings to watch the population stabilise in the history of our species. That's forecast within 2086 at the moment, and the figures come out soon. The forecast may come forward. You might think it's ridiculous that we forecast so many things, but we don't even know how many people there are going to be. The main reason the population is going up is that we're living longer. Not babies, is we're living longer. And that's connected to the environment because an area like Europe, but also Canada, the majority of the deaths currently associated with climate change are due to heat waves. They have more heat waves, and the people who die early because of a heat wave tend to be elderly and frail, and far more of us are going to live, thankfully, into our old age. And so selfishly, just individually, without worrying about future generations, and for the richest people on earth, because we're the ones who live the longest, it's the best off people, there is a direct message to be said about you could end your days early because of heat. And people might think, I'll get air conditioning and I'll just save myself. And it doesn't tend to work. It's one of the easiest things to measure epidemiologically because you just see a spike in the deaths, and then you can see the fewer deaths that occur afterwards, because obviously people were pretty frail, but they would have lived another 6 months, a year, 2 years. And certainly not suddenly die. So there's an incredible demographic story with climate change, which works in the direct interest of the richest countries on Earth, because we are the ones getting oldest first, the richest countries on Earth. And so literally, this could be my future. I'm 56 years old. At the rate at which the planet is warming, even though I'm lucky to be living on an island, which has a cooling effect, even then. If you're trying to get people to think forward, explaining that they can't just say, I won't worry about this will happen to other people or future generations. Actually, it could be you. And it's when the deaths due to what's called natural disasters are all added up, of those related to climate, which are increased floods and heat, it's heat waves that are the most deadly and increasing.
Yeah. Jennifer, I wonder how important it is to really drill down into the data. Particularly on the election campaign trail, we often hear ministers throw out statistics, whether that's about demographics or tax or money going to the health system. Voters can't possibly have all that information at their fingertips. And often this stuff is said in the heat of the moment. It goes out unchallenged, and then it becomes part of the narrative. How can that be stopped?
Well, at Compassion in Politics, the think tank which I co-lead, we would like to see a law introduced that would mean that deliberate political deception would be treated in the same way as deception in other areas. You know, this isn't rocket science. We've had laws against misrepresentation for many, many years, and they simply don't apply to political statements. So at the moment, it almost pays to lie. If you tell a lie and you repeat that lie, even if the public know it's not really true, it will somehow lodge in the brain. Ecologists call it the pink elephant paradox. Something that doesn't exist, even if we know it's untrue, gets lodged if it's repeated often enough. And so we think it's really, really important to try and stop the lies before they're said. And that means introducing proper rules and proper guidelines and proper laws and making it a criminal offence to deceive voters. If you think how serious it is, people are making their decision about who is going to govern them, who is going to decide their future, future generations' future, possibly globally, will have a role in the globe's future. And yet those people who are running for office are not bound to tell the truth. We take the truth very seriously in our culture. Think of the courtroom and the oath that we take. Think of the Hippocratic oath that doctors take. Think of how we regard truth in other areas, and yet we are not giving it that same primacy in the area of politics. It's really, really simple. We just need to extend the law that the courts adjudicate on all the time so that it applies to what's said in the political space as well as what's said in almost every other walk of life.
John, I wonder if I could just finally come to you for some closing comments for you just to wrap up what we've been discussing today.
Well, I think Jennifer and Danny have really kind of bracketed two sides of the issue. We have on the one hand this flaw, this kind of slackening standard for what good information is and for what we are allowed to hold our politicians and leaders to. And then on the other hand, we have this very real issue, climate change, that, as Danny said so graphically, is killing people en masse, and not just elders in the context of heat waves, but we've had mass deaths due to fire. We've had mass deaths due to flood. And then there are these knock-on effects of prolonged droughts, prolonged flood damage, which also feeds back into mass unemployment, which Danny spoke of at the top. And so these all these issues really fit into each other and kind of energize each other. But I feel like in a way that the core here is being able to speak honestly and in informed detail through every voice and organ of our democracy and our communication system. And that's where, and when we look at it like that, I think it's easy to identify the weaknesses, which have been enumerated eloquently by Jennifer and Danny, and which I think most citizens are aware of. You know, none of us wants to be lied to. A lot of us know when we're being played, when we're being condescended to, and it's deeply insulting to us as individuals, but it's also insulting to these extraordinary democracies that we contribute to by voting, and many of us by fighting for, dying for, and working for in peacetime to uphold and enrich. You know, when you look at it that way, as Jennifer said, it's not rocket science. It's really simple. You know, we're wanting and needing to be treated decently, and the first act of decency is not to lie, and that is kind of underpins everything else. And we can act with incredible power and incredible unity when we all believe the information we're acting on and believe in the mission. And that's why nobody died in the Fort McMurray fire. Nearly 100,000 people were pulled out of there safely. Everybody believed there was a fire. Everybody believed that their neighbor had a right to get out safely too. And so everybody checked on each other, and the social net closed and got everybody out of this extraordinarily fast-moving, dangerous situation safely. That's what we're capable of. We can do it in Britain. We can do it in Canada. We can do it around the world. And that's our true nature, I think.
Thank you so much, John Vaillant, also Danny Dorling and Jennifer Nadel, for taking the time to talk to us today. We'd once again like to thank the Blavatnik Family Foundation for its invaluable support of this podcast. To find out more about the Baillie Gifford Prize for Nonfiction, you can visit the website or follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube and TikTok at BG Prize. And if you enjoyed this podcast, do please write a review. Tune in next time to hear more from the world of literary nonfiction. Until then, goodbye. Read Smart, the Baillie Gifford Prize podcast. This podcast is generously sponsored by the Blavatnik Family Foundation.